We're joined now by Dr. Henry Kissinger from New York City. He's the author of his latest book, Years of Renewal, the third in his concluding memoirs on his years in Washington and at the State Department. Secretary Kissinger, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be on.
What were your years of renewal?
Well, those are mostly the years of the Ford administration after the huge national divisions of Vietnam and then the catastrophe of Watergate. President Ford came into office, the first non-elected president in American history, and I believe he restored America's confidence in itself. He restored cohesion to the government. He got us through a series of crises that he did it also matter-of-factly, that people haven't given him the credit which he deserves. But we could not have won the Cold War if President Ford, at a critical moment in our history, had not kept us from losing it.
You write in the book that President Nixon was fascinated by strategic options and devoted a great deal of his time to studying and discussing them. President Ford, by contrast, you write, would settle on goals in one or two crisp meetings in which everyone responsible for implementing the decision was given the opportunity to express his or her views. Afterward, he would permit himself no second thoughts. Can you elaborate?
First of all, one has to consider that presidents always function within the context in which they come into office. President Nixon came into office at the beginning of a need to reevaluate American foreign policy. We were stuck in Vietnam. We were divided on the issue of peace and war. We had massive demonstrations in the streets, and he spent a lot of his time in encouraging and redesigning American foreign policy. When President Ford came into office, we had a huge national crisis, but the main lines of the foreign policy were pretty well set, so that most of the decisions that had to be made were tactical decisions. Secondly, President Nixon was very cerebral and very analytical, and he really didn't like to meet people. He liked to spend his time reading and studying. President Ford was and is extremely gregarious, very open. He liked to hear by ear rather than study papers. President Nixon kept his options very close to his chest, and you never really quite knew where he was heading. President Ford was a classic Midwestern American. What you saw was what you got. So it was a difference in personalities, a difference in circumstance, and a difference in necessities for America.
When was the last time you talked with President Nixon?
I think I talked the last time to President Nixon about 3 months before his death.
And do you remember the gist of the conversation?
No, it was at the opening of the Nixon, there was a Nixon library being opened, and all of his former cabinet members came out, most of his former cabinet members came out, and I made a speech on behalf of the cabinet that had served him on foreign policy, and then at lunch, as the senior member, Secretary of State being the senior member of the cabinet, I made a toast to him. I may have talked to him on the phone once after that, but two months later he had a stroke and died.
Our guest is Dr. Henry Kissinger. He is joining us from New York City. He's the author of 12 books. His latest is the third part of his memoirs called Years of Renewal. We'll take a call from Orlando, Florida. Good morning.
Am I on?
You sure are. Good morning.
I'd like to ask Dr. Kissinger, how does he think President Nixon would have handled the Kosovo situation?
Well, the first thing President Nixon would almost surely have done is to ask, what is the American national interest here? Is this an issue over which we go to war, and what exactly is the issue? Secondly, it is absolutely inconceivable to me that President Nixon would have put down something like the Rambouillet proposal that we put forward, which really made a war inevitable because it forced the Serbs to accept things which no government could accept. I think the ethnic cleansing is of course a horrible thing, but the worst of the ethnic cleansing, most of the ethnic cleansing started after we started bombing, and that is what most people don't realize. Before that, there was a guerrilla war which was fought with Balkan brutality, but according to official international observers, the casualties up to then in 6 months before the Rambouillet proposal were only about 2,000. That's not great, but that's nothing like the horrific casualties that were caused later. So I believe he would have, he probably also before using air power would have tried to assemble ground forces to threaten a ground invasion and maybe thereby shorten the war. But his style was totally different than the current style.
Aranzuz Pass, Texas is next. Good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Kissinger.
How are you?
I'm trying to find out what's your opinion about our relationship with Red China and Russia.
Well, first, let me take Russia first. One has to, in each case, one has to look at the history, and one also has to ask oneself the question: what is our long-term objective here? And I would like to stress this has been the fundamental approach which the administrations in which I serve try to apply to international issues. Now, with respect to Russia, here's a country that really has had two basic histories. One, 400 years of imperialism and czarist rule, followed by about 80 years of, again, more or less imperialist history and communist rule. Now, starting about 1989, the central government is more or less disintegrated, and all the imperial gains for which they had suffered more than almost any other people in the world in governments that were really enormously oppressive. All those imperial gains were more or less lost. So now they are in territories that extend from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. That's 11 time zones, so they shouldn't feel claustrophobic. But in a way, they live in a totally new environment. The question for America is this: what is our principal task? To deal with the domestic politics of Moscow or with the foreign policy of Russia? I believe we should concentrate on the foreign policy of Russia. With respect to the foreign policy of Russia, what is our principal objective? We should keep Russia from risking itself and from risking the peace of the world in a constant attempt to expand its sphere. Right now, in the government in Moscow is a mess. The various market reforms have been a disaster, and Russia is going through an extremely paranoid period where it feels insecure. And recent events in Kosovo have brought home to them how impotent they have become. Here is Serbia, a traditional ally of Russia, and Russia has been in no position whatever to be of any meaningful assistance to it, or even to play a very major role in the settlement. So the problem we have with Russia is to see whether we can bring it back to the international community as a responsible member, but without this constant effort on our part to turn relations with it into a kind of psychiatric problem of personal relationship with their top leaders, which makes them feel even more insecure and which makes us look extremely condescending. Now, China is a different phenomenon. It's a country with a 5,000-year history. It's the longest self-governing country, the largest population in the world. And it is almost inconceivable to have a stable Asia when you have a China that is either too weak or too strong, because if it's too weak, all the neighbors rush in, as they did during the 30s. If it's too strong, it then becomes a menace to its neighbors.
One of the photographs in your book is that of your parents with President Ford in the Oval Office in January 1975. How and under what circumstances did you and your parents leave Germany in the late 1930s?
Well, in the 1930s, the Nazis, of course, were in power in Germany, and they were virulently anti-Semitic, and our family is Jewish. My father was a gymnasium teacher, which is sort of a middle school, first two-year college type school in Germany, and he lost his position, and life became so difficult and so oppressive that it was really my mother who decided that we should leave. And it was just in time, it was just before it turned violent. So in 1938 we came to the United States and started a new life here, and it's something I've never forgotten and for which I will be eternally grateful to this great country.
You write that your father died in 1982, but at the back of the book you include a personal note and a letter that you found. Can you explain the letter and why you included it in the book?
Well, in 1946, when I was in the army in Europe and my brother was in the army in Korea, my father became extremely ill, and they thought it was terminal cancer of the liver. He was in constant pain. He had lost a great deal of weight, and they operated. And they said they would make an exploratory operation, but they were pretty sure that the prognosis was what they had estimated, and that he would either die during the operation or not live very long afterwards. Communications weren't very great in those days. It was the immediate after the war period, so we couldn't talk on the telephone. So my father left a letter for my brother and me, a handwritten letter, in which he gave us some indication of what he was hoping for us and what he had tried to do for us, with us. Then it turned out that it wasn't cancer, that it was something that had launched. Well, it doesn't matter what the medical diagnosis was. At any rate, he recovered, and he lived 36 more years. I included the letter because at the end of the day, when you make foreign policy decisions, they always look very intellectual, very abstract, but the fact is you're shaped somewhat by your family history, and I wanted people to know the values on which I was brought up. I didn't claim, and I explicitly stated, that I don't say I lived up to all the values that my father thought I should, but on the other hand, I thought it was of some relevance to see what it was that at least contributed to my motivation, and also because I thought it was a very moving letter.
That book is included in Dr. Kissinger's latest work, Years of Renewal. It is almost 1,100 pages long. Our next call is from St. Augustine, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning. Dr. Kissinger, as you well know, you hold a great deal of respect from many of us in this country, and you'll get more attention than any partisan that would simply get on television. But I've been listening for years, and I have never, ever heard you have an opinion or ever say anything that wasn't conservative. So in a way, don't you think it would be fair to let the public know that you are an extreme partisan in all your views, because you are getting this respect that quietly you're hiding the fact that you're a partisan in everything you ever say and everything you ever do. Thank you.
Well, you are not the best judge of your activities. I consider myself primarily concerned with the national interest of the United States. I have tried to be helpful to every president, and I have had the privilege of being asked by many presidents, including Democratic presidents, to either for advice or to do little errands. And I don't consider myself a partisan conservative. And in fact, if you look at the whole record, you will find that I have been quite frequently attacked by the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And I do not believe that foreign policy is a partisan issue. I think it's something that affects all Americans and that has to be carried out regardless of what party is in office, along more or less parallel lines, because the national interest of the United States doesn't change every 4 or 8 years.
Las Vegas, good morning for Dr. Kissinger.
Yes, good morning. Please bear with me. I'm a little bit nervous. Good morning, Dr. Kissinger. I respect you greatly, but I have to say that I am a Serbian, ethnic Serbian, and American citizen, and I've been living in this country for 29 years. And I was Democrat all this time that I lived here, and I supported Mr. Clinton until this war that he doesn't call a war. I will never be or vote Democrat again. Now I'm without party, but I will vote for best people. I believe that I can use my judgment. I listened to your when you were a witness in the Congress, and I agree with everything you said there. But obviously they didn't, and they did start a war. I believe this war was totally legally, and I did not have to read the newspaper. I left Yugoslavia in 1967. I had a family that lived in Kosovo, and I know everything from my family, and some of them live in Canada, and actually the day on the 24th of March, the day of the bombing, I happened to be there for a family wedding, and my mother's cousins came from Kosovo for the same wedding, and out of 100 members of our family, they were expelled. Only 2 were living there.
Thanks for the call. Comment, Henry Kissinger?
Well, as the caller indicated, I testified before the House Foreign Relations Committee and warned against the initiation of the war. I thought the objective of preserving lives and some degree of coexistence between Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo could be achieved without bombing, and that bombing would make the human condition worse. I still think that. However, after the war started, and after the United States had committed itself and involved also the whole NATO alliance, I believed that at that point we had to achieve our objectives by military means, because losing the war would have had terrible consequences for the future of the Atlantic Alliance. And at that point, I supported President Clinton in the pursuit of the war, even though I was opposed to starting it.
Durham, North Carolina, good morning.
Hi. Just a couple quick questions. One that confuses me is what's the basis for presuming that ethnic cleansing would not have occurred to the extent that it had there not been NATO bombing, given, and I don't know much about the history over there, but what I do know is what the Slavs did in Bosnia, and in particular Srebrenica, which I understand was a UN safe zone, and the eyes of the world were watching, and they didn't seem to have any reticence at all about massacring thousands of people in that kind of a circumstance. And secondly, I'm curious as to why I watch a lot of the cable and a lot of the C-SPAN shows, why so many of retired generals and statespersons who predicted, I think it seems to me overwhelmingly, that air power wouldn't work, that Milosevic wouldn't cave in, and with all that having happened, I don't hear any spokespersons acknowledging the fact that their predictions were significantly off the mark.
Well, let me take the last part of the question first. I never argued that we couldn't win. I always said from the first day of the war that 19 NATO nations with 600 million population, including almost all the industrial nations of the world, were bound to win against 10 million Serbs whose economy is underdeveloped and who had no major war industry and no significant means of defending themselves against air attack. So my reason for being against the war was that it would draw us into the Balkans, into an interminable administration of ethnic conflicts from which there would be no exit, in which one so-called solution would lead to another problem, as it will, because now Macedonia and Montenegro and other ethnic groups are up for it. So I personally never argued that the war couldn't be won. In fact, once the war started, I supported the president on every television appearance and every article that I wrote. Now, what reason is there to suppose that massive ethnic cleansing wouldn't have started without the war? That's a question of judgment. I believe if we had used force or using force, we should have waited until it had started and not start bombing on the assumption that it might start or would start. What the Serbs did in Srebrenica and the ethnic cleansing that they did undertake in Bosnia is absolutely unforgivable and is an outrageous war crime. And I'm not defending ethnic cleansing in any shape or form.
Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's latest book is called Years of Renewal, published by Simon & Schuster. A couple of names that you mentioned in the book. I'd like you to briefly give us your observation on these individuals and why you included them in the book. First, former Vice President Nelson Rockefeller.
Well, Nelson Rockefeller was the man who got me involved in politics, with whom I worked for many years in his pursuit of the presidency. And even though I wound up as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State for President Nixon, I had never met Nixon when he appointed me, and in fact I'd always opposed him in the entourage of Nelson Rockefeller. I thought he was a man of great inspiration, and I thought then and I think now he would have made a great president, a great patriot, and a man of great vision.
Why did his party never nominate him?
Because perhaps he was too much on the liberal wing, or what's thought liberal wing or moderate wing of the party, and because he didn't really come from the party establishment, and partly because he made bad mistakes. He did not go after the presidency in the way it has now become fashionable. He thought you become president by having the best program, so he would spend months developing a program while while his opponents were chasing candidates, and you can't become president before you are nominated. And he thought he could cut short the nominating process.
Former Senator, former Vice President Hubert Humphrey.
I loved Hubert Humphrey. We were in opposite parties. He was a liberal Democrat. He was a tremendous human being of great warmth, with whom I shared many objectives. He was a classic example of the kind of bipartisanship and elder statesmanship that is very rare today, and in many critical periods of my political life. He was there in 1976, an election year in which he was a candidate, or a potential candidate. I came to Minnesota as a Republican Secretary of State, and he went around with me from town to town introducing me. I don't think it helped his presidential prospects any, but it was good for American foreign policy.
Former Washington Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, another Democrat.
Well, Scoop Jackson was a conservative Democrat, very dedicated to national defense, also a great patriot. He became a very hardline opponent of the Soviet Union, as I was too, but he began to challenge the foreign policy of Nixon from the right rather than from the left, where the Democrats usually were. And he developed extraordinary parliamentary ingenuity in coming up with proposals which would be passed by the Senate, which would make it very difficult to conduct the negotiations that were going on. He and I shared most objectives. We wound up on opposite sides of the tactical debates, and I respected him greatly. I wrote a note in the book in which I described our tactical differences, but wound up giving him great credit for first maintaining America's eye on the ball of national defense at a period of divisions that the current generation cannot even imagine. And secondly, for his general concern with foreign policy and patriotism, even if he and I differed on some of the tactics.
Have you read any of the excerpts of Bob Woodward's latest book, Shadow, the presidencies since Watergate?
No, I've seen him on a national interview program discussing it, but I have not actually read it.
In the book and in those interviews, he also writes about your conversation with former President Nixon on August the 8th, either the 7th or the 8th of 1974, in which the two of you were in the Lincoln bedroom the night before he resigned. He resigned formally on August the 9th of 1974. What happened?
Well, he wrote about that once before already in his first book about the Watergate crisis. It was the last night of the, next to the last night of the Nixon presidency, but the last night in which he controlled the agenda, because the next night he had to make television appearances. And he called me up and invited me to come to the Lincoln sitting room where we had had many substantive meetings. And one has to remember that President Nixon was an unnatural politician. He found it difficult to meet new people. He had, with enormous strength and willpower, made himself a candidate, and here he was at the end of his public career, and he knew that much of it was caused by mistakes he had made, even though I believe then and I believe now that he was punished beyond what he had done. So he was. It was a very moving, a very sad occasion in which he wondered how history would treat him, and I said history will treat you better than your contemporaries, which turned out to be correct. And so it was a very mellow conversation. One has to remember I came to his entourage as a Rockefeller disciple, and I, at that point, was the last one left of his original entourage. It was a very poignant occasion. And at the end of it, he asked me to join him in a prayer in the Lincoln bedroom, and a lot of fun has been made of that, and I thought it was one of the most moving occasions of my life, of a man who had his life's work destroyed, made it worse partly by his own actions, and I will always think of President Nixon with respect, and of that evening as a worthy moment, not as something that you afterwards caricature.
As you left the Lincoln sitting room, do you remember now what was going through your mind then?
Well, I was just overwhelmed by the tragedy of the occasion, and my overwhelming desire was to ease his exit from the presidency to the greatest extent possible, and at the same time to see how we could. I would be the person that would be left in the foreign policy field, and when you lose a presidency under those conditions, there's always the danger in the middle of the Cold War that somebody would take a run at you, and that your credibility and your general fitness to conduct foreign policy would disintegrate. So I just thought in a very general way how to deal with the transition period. But above all, that evening, I walked over. I had an office in the West Wing of the White House, and I walked over there and I sat with Eagleburger and General Scowcroft, who were my two close aides, and Nixon called and said, please don't make people think I was weak, and it never occurred to me that he was weak. It was as shattering an evening as I ever want to spend in my life.
And it's at that point that the latest book picks up. In August of '74, with the start of the Ford administration, Secretary Kissinger served in the Nixon and Ford administrations. Our next call is from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Good morning.
Good morning. Dr. Kissinger, I recently read a book by Ambassador Dobrynin,
Yes.
in which he said, contrary to popular opinion, that President Reagan did not win the Cold War, but rather the Soviet Union had lost the Cold War due to internal economic and political considerations. And I was wondering if you agreed with that or what your views were on that. Thank you.
Well, my views are that both statements are true to some extent. The Soviet Union lost the Cold War because it had an economic system that made it increasingly uncompetitive in the modern technological world. And as time went on, even when at the height of the Cold War, I remember my own astonishment when I went to Moscow officially, and I saw the general sloppiness and inefficiency with which everything was run. Secondly, the Soviet diplomacy was so clumsy that by the time the 70s were over, there was an alliance against it of all the industrial nations, plus China, the world's most populous nation. So all of that contributed to the weakness and incipient collapse of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, President Reagan crystallized American determination, and he conducted a very strong and able foreign policy, which in my view didn't cause the collapse, but it certainly accelerated it and managed it with great skill.
Stallion Springs, California. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Kissinger, for your tremendous service to our country.
Thank you.
Earlier on in the program, you were asked to give an overview on Russia and China. And you got your view on Russia out, but you didn't really get your view on China out. Could you do that, please?
I'm glad you gave me a chance to complete this. But I'd gone on too long on Russia. China is in many respects a key country of Asia. It's the most populous country. It has 60 million overseas Chinese, who control the economy of many surrounding countries. And therefore, the relations between China and the United States are crucial for the peace of Asia. If we are challenged, and we have no choice, we, of course, must resist Chinese pressures, just as we resisted other pressures in previous situations. But I don't think it's foreordained that we and China must be in an adversarial relationship. China is at a relatively early stage of development. It has enormous domestic problems, and it has, people keep projecting a growth rate that was true for a 10-year period into all eternity. That has never happened in history. So I believe that it is important for the United States to attempt to maintain a reasonable relationship with China, also because if we and China clash, every other nation in Asia is going to have to choose sides, and they won't choose sides. They will navigate between us. So I think I support the Clinton administration's attempt to have constructive relationships with China, but of course we will defend our national interest if it is challenged.
In the years that you served as Secretary of State, which foreign leader did you have the easiest working relationship with, and which one did you have the most difficult relationship with?
Well, among our allies, we always had the very easy relationships with the British, who had a tradition of cooperating with us, especially Prime Minister Callahan when he came into office. But we had very close relations especially in the Ford administration with the French, German, and British leaders. And I want to pay special tribute to President Sadat of Egypt, who was one of the great men that I met, who started out as an adversary and became the key to Middle East peace, and who transformed Egypt and part of the Arab world from being enemies of the United States to a very friendly relationship, by far the most difficult relationship, were the Vietnamese negotiators. They were out to break our spirit, they were out to break our country. They were assisted unwittingly by many well-meaning people in the United States who created the impression that their own government didn't want peace, and therefore they kept playing games. They kept playing games with us. I can mention one occasion. They gave us a 9-point peace program secretly and a 7-point peace program publicly, and I'd asked them, which do you want to negotiate? So secretly, they told us they wanted to negotiate the 9-point secretly, and while we were negotiating the 9-point secretly, they kept demanding publicly that we answer the 7 points which they told us not to negotiate. And so we kept being battered between a very skillful psychological campaign, and they were great. They were determined to win. They stopped at nothing, and that was the most painful relationship.
Aranzis past Texas is next. Good morning. Hello, caller. Good morning.
Sir, I was a participant in the Southeast Asia War Games, and I want to thank you very, very much for stopping that bloodshed that we went into and had the carnage going on.
Thank
I think
you.
you're a diplomat's diplomat. At my brother's wedding, I met a Major Lee who was Mr. Eagleburger's bodyguard, I believe, and you had a terrific staff, and me as just a simple man down here in Texas wanted to thank you for everything you did. And I think you're a diplomat's diplomat, and the world's a lot safer place because of your efforts, and I wanted to thank you. Thank you, sir.
That means a great deal to me. Thank you very much.
How did Henry Kissinger go from being a professor at Harvard to the President's National Security Advisor in 1969?
Well, you know, I've read many stories of how I schemed to achieve this and plotted my way to that position. But I think it's important to remember this. As I said earlier in the program, I was a supporter of Nelson Rockefeller in 3 presidential campaigns. I never even met Nixon when he asked me to be National Security Advisor. And in fact, when he asked me, I told him that I had opposed him for 12 years, and that I needed a week to think about my relationship to my friends if I became Nixon's advisor, and he very generously gave me a week. But Nelson Rockefeller talked me out of it and said, "Take it now." That's the immediate mechanics. The longer-term thing is, I wrote diplomatic history, and I had been very interested in how peace was made and how peace broke down, and I had written some studies of that for the 19th century and outbreak of World War I, and then I began commenting on contemporary affairs. So I became really more or less, partly accidentally, a participant in the contemporary debate, but always as a scholar. And it never occurred to me that I would be National Security Advisor to President Nixon. Secretary of State was so beyond my imagination that never in my youthful or any other dreams had occurred to me. And from that point of view, my life has been partly accidental, even though in retrospect you can sort of describe it as if it were foreordained. But to me, going through it, it didn't seem that way.
What was your partnership like with then Secretary of State William Rogers in the first part of the Nixon term?
Very tough, and the fault was importantly mine, but it's also inherent in the job descriptions. The security advisor has an office next to the president or near the president, a minute away. The Secretary of State is in a different building, 10-minute car ride away. And it's an interesting psychological problem why it is that the security advisor is in the same building almost always has more influence than the Secretary of State, who is a 10-minute car ride away. I think the only exception that I know is Secretary Schultz under President Reagan. In every other case, they all say they're not going to get into this problem of the security advisor vis-a-vis the Secretary of State. It always comes up, and for a number of good reasons. The Secretary of State has 160 clients in foreign nations. The security advisor deals only with the important problems and with the problems that most concern the president. So the Secretary of State usually brings a whole bunch of problems to the White House that are pains in the neck and that are nuisances and that the president really doesn't want to deal with. And the security advisor is always on the hot button issues. And so it tends to happen that it gravitates to security advisor. In the case of Rogers, who was an outstanding human being, but he had no experience in foreign policy, and Nixon was very determined to keep control of foreign policy in the White House. So my relations with Rogers were not good, and I am not especially proud of the way we handled it.
And you kept both titles after 1973, did you not?
I had both titles. That's not a good system because I was National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. So as Secretary of State, I was responsible for the views of the State Department and shaping them. Then as National Security Advisor, I had to chair interdepartmental meetings in which the State Department was represented by the Deputy Secretary of State, and I, as Security Advisor, had to adjudicate. But of course, the Deputy Secretary of State represented my views. How could he do anything else? There couldn't be another position in the State Department. So the other departments had every right to feel that the State Department was getting an additional hearing by having both positions. And it actually was not all that comfortable for me either. And while when they took the security position away from me, it was painful because in Washington, the appearance of power is power itself. It was the right decision that President Ford made.
San Diego, good morning.
Good morning. I have a question about, in light of today, we know that the CIA told us the Soviet Union was stronger than they were, apparently. Do you think that your policy of détente, if you had only adopted the policy of Reagan and just met the Soviet Union head-on like he did, that maybe the Cold War could have ended 15 years earlier and so many countries not have been destroyed and people not slaughtered? And if you'd fast forward to today, please, the current security advisor who apparently knew about our scandals at our nuclear labs and that perhaps our nuclear secrets have been stolen by China, and also they have given supposedly campaign contributions to the current president. Could you comment today, is our president too powerful if he can be this corrupt?
Well, first of all, no country was taken over by the Soviet Union. No people were slaughtered by the Soviet Union in the period in which I served, other than Vietnam, in which the war was started by the previous administration and in which we desperately tried to preserve the American position against the most violent demonstrations in American history. In every other situation, when the Soviets built a naval base in Cuba and in Angola, in every situation where the Soviet Union put a toe across a dividing line, we resisted most strenuously. Secondly, we had to navigate in a situation in which there were the most violent demonstrations and to cut the military budget and to prevent any serious foreign policy. And I don't believe that your basic premise that as a result of the policy of détente, the Soviet Union was enabled to expand. It was, we lined up China in an anti-Soviet coalition, and we conducted as incidentally Dobrynin says in his book, a very strong anti-Soviet foreign policy. Now, in the present situation, I have frequently and constantly, in fact, disagreed with many aspects of the Clinton foreign policy, and I thought they were lax in security or thoughtless. But I would not describe the security advisor as corrupt, even remotely. I think he's a patriotic American who is in an office in which you always have more to do than you can possibly do, and he made the wrong choice of priorities when he received the information about security violations and perhaps didn't pursue it as energetically as now in retrospect we think he should have.
Chester Springs, Pennsylvania, for Henry Kissinger.
Dr. Kissinger, I have a question on foreign policy versus domestic policy and the resources that you would or have to commit, how you make the various trade-offs, given that the resources of the country are not infinite. But before I launch into that, I'd like to associate myself with the previous caller's comments on the contribution that you made to this country.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. The question you ask, it's very hard to answer in the abstract. I don't think that one can say domestic issues are in one basket and foreign policy are in another basket, because the two things are really very closely related. The American policy has to start with American security, and one cannot take the slightest risks with American security, and one has to pay what is needed to maintain a military establishment and a security policy that protects us. On the other hand, our resources, as you correctly pointed out, are not infinite. And one reason that I was leery about the Balkan involvement is because I think it is not an area of primary strategic interest for the United States. And I do not want to disperse our resources all over the world. I would have thought the Gulf is an area of much greater strategic interest for the United States. But these are judgments. These are among the most difficult judgments presidents and secretaries of state and security advisors have to make.
If President Ford had been reelected in 1976, would you have stayed on as Secretary of State?
That's a very good question. The first question is, would he have asked me? I think he probably would have. By that time, I had served 8 years, and it was a turbulent period. I kept myself going through the 76 campaign by telling myself that I would leave at that point, and I kept my wife happy by saying that. But I'm quite sure that had the president asked me to stay, I would have stayed, because fundamentally, I believe when the president asks you to do something, you do it. You have a national obligation to do it.
Primrose, North Carolina, good morning.
Hi, Pembroke.
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Dr. Kissinger, I have to tell you that I'm not your greatest fan, but I saw your biography on A&E, and I must say I found myself much more sympathetic to you afterwards. But some of your past troubles me, and I hope that this morning you might open your heart and speak truthfully to the American people about the events of October in 1968. According to Seymour Hersh's book, The Price of Power, you got wind of LBJ's peace plans for Vietnam in October of 68, and Warren, Nixon, and Agnew, and Hersh writes, quote, "It is certain that the Nixon campaign, alerted by Kissinger to the impending success of the peace talks, was able to get a series of messages to the TU government, the South Vietnamese government, making it clear that a Nixon presidency would have different views on the peace negotiations." Now, the Republican emissary to South Vietnam apparently was Anna Chennault, who was working with the Nixon campaign. And Hersh quotes Johnson cabinet official saying U.S. intelligence agencies had caught on that Chennault was the go-between between Nixon and his people and President Chiu in Saigon.
I'm going to stop you there. We'll have time for a response. Thanks for the call.
What Anna Chennault did, whom I didn't know at the time, I do not know. Bill Bundy, who was Assistant Secretary of State for Asian Affairs, and who has written an extraordinarily critical book of me, has nevertheless always pointed out that this is an absolutely outrageous charge. I had no knowledge of what the Johnson administration was doing. I told John Mitchell that in my judgment, it was in the Vietnamese interest to try to make an agreement before the election in order to tie down both political parties to such an agreement, and therefore they should keep in mind that such an agreement was very possible. I had no knowledge of the details of the negotiation. I obviously therefore couldn't give them any secret information. I think this is a lie and a distortion of a fragmentary record, and this is not something that, and in fact Nixon in his own book said that I warned him so often against getting himself into the peace negotiations that he thought I might be an emissary of the other side.
Columbia, South Carolina, for Henry Kissinger. Good morning.
Dr. Kissinger, this is Randy Nelson, an old dumb Secret Service agent that's retired, and I appreciate all your efforts on the behalf of our country, and I wonder if
I appreciate all the efforts of the Secret Service on my behalf when they were protecting me.
Well, I was wondering, Doctor, if you heard from Walter Bothy in recent years.
Walter Bothy was on my Secret Service detail, and we had many adventures together. When I left government, he left with me and joined my personal security detail when it was thought I needed one. He unfortunately died several years ago of cancer, but he was a wonderful human being, and he did enormous things for me and my family.
Is there one moment, one personal moment, that you look back on in your years as Secretary of State?
Well, as Secretary of State, one of the most moving moments was when I was sitting in a room with Sadat and Aswan, and we were talking about negotiations that were going on between Israel and Egypt, in which we were acting as mediator. And somebody brought in a note to Sadat, and he got up and walked over to me and kissed me on both cheeks. And he said, they've just signed the disengagement agreement on the along the Suez Canal. I will today take off my uniform, and I will never wear it again except on ceremonial occasions. That was one of those occasions that makes service in government with all its pressures worthwhile.
Our last call from Knoxville, Tennessee.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. On October 11th, 1963, President Kennedy issued what was to be his last National Security Action Memoranda, number 263. He authorized an initial withdrawal of 1,000 U.S. troops from Vietnam as the first step of a pullout to be substantially completed by the end of 1965. This was negated on November 26th, 4 days after his assassination, by President Johnson, who issued the NSAM 273, which clearly increased our escalation rather than disengaged.
Caller, I'm going to jump in because we only have about a minute left with Henry Kissinger. Do you have a brief question?
Question is, do you think had President Kennedy lived that we would have involved ourselves in Vietnam as we did?
I was not in the government at the time, so I have no personal knowledge. And I have heard intense arguments on both sides of the issue from people who served with him. And I really can't make up my mind between those points of view that are strongly held. Some say he would have gone on, others say he would have pulled out. I just don't know enough to make that judgment.
The book is called Years of Renewal, the concluding volume of his memoirs. Henry Kissinger, Before we let you go, Dr. Kissinger, we're reading this morning about the Clinton doctrine when it comes to foreign policy. What's the Kissinger doctrine? What are the frameworks of your foreign policy beliefs?
Well, if the Clinton doctrine is that the United States must involve itself, if necessary, militarily, anywhere in the world where acts are committed that we consider unjust, I think that is beyond our capability. The Kissinger doctrine, if there is a Kissinger doctrine, is that the United States must carefully define its national interest. That national interest, of course, must involve our moral values, but we must not overextend ourselves by engaging ourselves in conflicts that we cannot sustain, that will tear our country apart. On the other hand, we must engage ourselves in those conflicts that involve our security and our fundamental principles. But I would warn strongly against undifferentiated involvement anywhere in the world, and to think that American military force can solve every problem anywhere in the world, including in regions which we do not understand very well.
And in the words of your father that you included in the book on page 1079, he wrote to you and your brother, "Always keep in mind that we find real satisfaction only in what we are doing for others. Try always to be good, faithful, helpful, reliable, and selfless." Did you follow his advice?
I certainly took it very seriously, but I surely didn't always live up to it.
Henry Kissinger, the author of Years of Renewal by Simon & Schuster, joining us from New York. Thank you, Dr. Kissinger, for being with us. We're going to take a short break and then open our phone lines to get your comments on this Tuesday morning. Coming up in about 25 minutes, we'll have live coverage of a joint Senate hearing looking at security at Energy Department labs. But first, some scenes around Washington on what this is the first official day, full day of summer. It began yesterday afternoon at 3:34 East Coast time.